We recently had a movie that came out that took place during the early days of the pandemic, and it was called Sick, and that's on Peacock. Now, Netflix is bringing a Spanish crime thriller called Infiesto that has the first days of lockdown as its backdrop. Luckily, though, the pandemic, it isn't really the story driver. But does that mean it's worth watching? On the first day of national lockdown, two detectives are called to a small mining town where a young woman has appeared after being missing for years. While the world is falling apart and personal tragedy strikes all around, the detectives soon notice that the virus might not be the only dark force at work. So the film starts out fairly mysteriously and slightly dark, where we see this young woman who looks to be in pretty bad shape. She's walking down the road, kind of in a trance or a dazed state of mind. We learn very quickly that she's been missing for quite a while, leading investigators to scurry about to try and find the clues to where she'd been and if someone had taken her. For as much as I'm not a huge fan of using the pandemic and lockdown as story devices, for this movie, it really works to help create a lonely and isolating atmosphere. As the investigators drive through the towns, all the streets are vacant. No traffic, no pedestrians, shops all closed. It's eerie and it resembles a ghost town. And for a lot of places, it really was like that when global lockdowns were taking effect. But because there's a lack of people, and because the townspeople are beginning to get on edge due to rising sickness that we hear about in news reports and on the inspectors' radios and TVs, anybody they come into contact with out in the wild feels very cagey, untrusting, and sometimes a little bit off. And I like what that does for the story because it puts everybody on edge, and that raises some suspicions about the characters that we come in contact with. The main focus for the story outside of the young woman who had been missing are the two inspectors, and I really wish they weren't strangers to us. We have tiny glimpses into their lives, but not enough to become hugely invested in them. We know the male investigator has had some sort of professional issues in the past, but what they are, pretty much a mystery. And the female investigator seems a bit wary of her partner, so if we knew what his deal was, we'd get a better perspective on her behaviors around him. Now, all this may not seem hugely important, but there are moments within the story where the gravity of a situation can vary greatly depending on how much you've connected with the characters. So to have them be relative strangers to us works against some of the story's impact. Now, as far as the mystery goes in this, it's a very straightforward story. There's not a lot of misdirection or even missteps the investigators make in the case. They go to a location, they find some clues, then they go to the next spot. To drive suspense and intrigue, the puzzle, it kind of needs to be harder, or at least it's better when the cops have to work a lot harder at figuring out what's going on. The lack of actual detective work made the story progress quickly, but it also removed tension and excitement. There's also some lore that comes into play, but wow, it's barely touched on. It's explained enough to make sense for the story, but the background feels so much richer than what's given to us. Like, we get the Reader's Digest version of a massive amount of intriguing detail. I think to a movie like Sherlock Holmes, where there is lore that the movie rests on. While it may not always be the focal point, it is established and developed so when it pops in and out, we have a good understanding on how it impacts all of the arcs. The same goes in this movie, except we don't have all the establishing detail and the development that makes it a strong voice within the story. It's just kind of periphery. That's a bummer. To the movie's credit, there is some urgency that's built into the final act. Now, I'm not saying that the progression isn't completely obvious. The scenes switch between two locations with a rising musical score, and it becomes very predictable about what is going to transpire. Even before all the pieces begin to fall into place. But the music helps to instill a sense of quickness, and that leads to some tension. And then a very shocking scene that I wasn't expecting at all. So for as obvious and predictable as the setup was leading into the final climax, there was still a portion that shocked me. And I totally appreciate that. The movie's relatively short at just 96 minutes, so at least it's a quick watch. But everything sits surface level, and the lack of story depth and detail, it does impact the overall enjoyment, and certainly the memorableness. I was excited to check it out because I'm a massive fan of non-English crime dramas and thrillers, but this was unfortunately just a very forgettable experience. The acting is decent, with characters that are brooding and slightly mysterious, and the lore that's introduced lends itself to becoming dark and twisted. But the lack of time spent delving into the lore, it reduces any uneasiness and deeper mystery. I wanted to like this so much more than I did. I mean, it's not terrible and it held my attention for the runtime. I just don't feel like I'll remember it by the weekend, and then I have no desire to ever rewatch it. There's no sex or nudity, a lot of profanity, and some very brutal violence. I give Infiesto 2.5 out of 5 couches. So are there any mysteries you've watched lately, or maybe crime thrillers that you really enjoyed? Let me know about them in the comments below. If you enjoyed this review, please give it a like. Also, don't forget to share and subscribe. I'm Chris. This is Movies and Munchies. Thanks for couching with me.